This morning, as part of our 50th anniversary celebration, we're going to have some of the long-term members here give us their reminiscences over the early days. Swami Sappakashananda started to work excuse me, in 1938 and continued it for 41 years. Now, I don't know what these speakers are going to say, but I think you're going to find that he was a spiritual teacher of the first order. You might call him a spiritual physician. You know the three types of physicians. The third class physician prescribes the medicine and tells the patient to take it, and there the matter rests. The second class physician prescribes the medicine, tells the patient to take it, and then inquires later to see if he has taken it, and there the matter rests. The first class physician prescribes the medicine, tells the patient to take it, checks up on him, and if he hasn't taken the medicine, he throws him down, puts his knee on his chest, pries open his mouth, and pours the medicine in. Swami was this type of a physician, as I had occasion to learn several times. Before we go into the talk, I'd like to make one statement that these are all personal reminiscences. So the personal pronoun I will appear quite frequently in these talks. Don't think that this is an ego trip for these people. Most of them would rather be sitting down there with you than standing up here talking. So our first reminiscence comes from Mae Kunz. Mae is our oldest member in time of being in Vedanta. She came when Swami gave one of his first lectures. She has written out her reminiscences and asked somebody to read them, so I'll ask Lynn Lamphear to read her reminiscences. Lynn?
Thank you, Ray. Reminiscences of Mae Kunz, Swami Sappakashananda, his first years in St. Louis. When my husband and I came to Vedanta, the Oldendorfs were very important to Swami Sappakashananda. They were special. Every place Swami wanted to go, they would take him. They tended to all his needs. The Oldendorfs played an important part in the beginning of Vedanta in St. Louis. They had circulars made that were printed with Swami's lecture times on Sundays, his Tuesday and Thursday evening classes, and also the noon meditation schedule. Mrs. Oldendorf would go to each house during the day and place a circular under the door. When evening came, both would go door to door, covering a different neighborhood each week. After the lecture on Sunday, they took him home for noon and evening meals. If the weather was nice, in the afternoon Ed Oldendorf would put up the badminton set and they would play. Swami Sappakashananda would always win, just like Swami Chaitananda always wins now. Mrs. Oldendorf took charge of all the out-of-town guests. She also took care of the dinners and those living in St. Louis who were interested in Vedanta. Swami left everything up to her, including what food to serve. Besides the Oldendorf, there were other special workers. Mrs. Ryan and Ruth Peterson were two others who helped. They came from Unity. Swami said they have love in their hearts. He depended on them for the smaller things. One time, Mrs. Ryan mended a rug for Swami, and you couldn't even tell it had been mended. She was very handy for many things. Both served with much love and devotion. Then, very suddenly, Mrs. Ryan passed away. Swami really missed her. We all did. Later, Mrs. Schrader came and helped financially. Then after some time, she passed away also. There was a young girl by the name of Jane. She enlarged Swami's pictures from India and watercolored them. The picture of Sri Ramakrishna was enlarged and watercolored also. You can see them at the temple. I have one small one of Ramakrishna's face, and it's just beautiful. There are also others who helped, but I can't remember faces or names. For these people in the beginning, we cannot give enough thanks. All gave what they could with love and devotion to Swami and Vedanta. Swami started on October 23rd, 1938. We read in the paper about Swami's lectures. We couldn't go because of the weather and snowstorms. We didn't have a car, and we had to take 3 buses to get there. The first time my husband and I went to the hotel to hear Swami lecture was the first week in January, 1939. We sat in the front row, and it was like food for the soul. I don't remember the name of the lecture. I was thinking, here is a monk from a monastery in India. I never dreamt it would be for the rest of my life. After the lecture, he told the audience that every weekday at noon there was a meditation at his apartment. I asked my husband if he cared if I attended the meditation. My husband said for me to go. The next day I attended the meditation. There were 4 of us. He had a row of chairs for us to sit in, and he placed his chair in the middle very close to the front of us. He told us to close our eyes, and then very softly and slowly he said this prayer. Let us relax our body and mind, gather our thoughts, and meditate on the divine being within our hearts, radiating peace, love, wisdom, and bliss. Sit with the back and the neck in one straight vertical line. Do not make the body stiff. Sit easy and poised. Think that your seat is stable and firm, your body steady and motionless. The atmosphere around you is pure, wholesome, serene, and blissful. Breathe slowly and gently. Think that you are inhaling through your nostrils something purifying, inspiring, and uplifting. Think all the impurities of the body are burnt off. The body is pure, healthy, and strong. A sacred temple of the divine. All that is gross and unhealthy about the organs and senses is purged off. The organs and the senses are refined, renovated, and pacified. All the dross and dirt of our minds is washed out. The mind is clean, calm, and bright, a true receptacle of the divine light. And the Swami went on with another prayer. There is peace in the innermost depth of my being. My soul is ever calm and peaceful. The movements of the body, the movements of the mind, do not disturb that calmness. It is so serene and blissful. Let that calmness flood our entire being. Let our mind be permeated by that calmness. All the waves of the mind are gone. Our mind is quiet. Our body is calm. There is calmness in our entire being. There is calmness outside of us, calmness in the atmosphere, calmness in the trees, calmness everywhere in nature, calmness in the heart of each and every living thing. All the movements of the universe are bubbles on the infinite ocean of calmness. The mad excitement of the living moment of nature does not disturb that calmness. I am that ocean of calmness. It is so serene, so blissful. I am soaked through and through with that calmness. Peace, it is our silence. Peace, bliss, absolute. I am one with that. These are the only 2 prayers that I have. The Swami always changed them a little. By that time in the meditation, our minds had become silent. Not a wave was in our minds. Then he became silent, and we continued to think of the divine being in our hearts and the calmness all around us. Our meditations were wonderful. Each finding in our bodies did not want to move. After meditation, we were so relaxed and did not want to get up, we had to fix lunch. We had so much fun while we were cooking, laughing all the while. After cleaning up, we sat and talked with Swami. We asked him questions, which he would answer as we listened. The next day I went early to fix lunch. I opened the refrigerator and found it was empty. I went out to buy food and told the others about it. We then either cooked or baked something to bring or brought things to fix there. We saw to it that the Swami had enough food. When cleaning time came, Swami did the cooking. While he cooked, he told stories of India and would talk about when he was growing up. All I remember is that Swami said he went horseback riding and swimming a lot. One day I brought flowers from the Swami's garden for Swami's altar. He looked at me and smiled for a long time. Then he told me he had planned to leave St. Louis because none of us showed any devotion by bringing flowers or other things to offer to the Lord. He was standing by the window facing the altar as he said this. I can still see him standing there by the window. I told the Swami, Americans are not brought up to think of an altar, much less to offer flowers. After that, we saw there were flowers for the altar. In fact, his apartment had so many flowers that the walls were lined with them. At night, he had to take them outside his door so he'd have enough oxygen to breathe while he slept. It was hard for us in the beginning, not knowing the rules and customs that Swami had. They were more or less monastery rules. But it wasn't any easier for Swami because he was unfamiliar with our customs. It was trial and error for a while. Maybe he should have written down his customs and rules. It would have made it a lot easier on all of us. A few rules I do recall. For example, one isn't supposed to smell the flowers when offering them to the Lord. And Swami did write down and give me some spiritual rules to follow. He also gave the meanings for each of them. When I received initiation, Swami gave me a mantra and prayer to Sri Ramakrishna, and a prayer and a mantra to Swami Brahmananda. I was initiated in 1943 or 1944. The 10 spiritual rules and 2 prayers that were given are as follows. The 10 spiritual rules. These instructions were given to me by Swami Saprakasananda. 1. Posture. Sit with the neck and back in one straight vertical line. The body must be cozy and poised. The body must be steady and motionless. 2. Prayer. Pray to Sri Ramakrishna for purity, devotion, and true knowledge. Take yourself into him and make him your own. 3. Think of God in all. See and know that God lives in the heart of all people, and know that there is good in everyone. 4. Think of peace everywhere. Think that the atmosphere of the whole universe is pure and peaceful. Think there is peace in the innermost depth of my being. That the atmosphere around me is pure, serene, and blissful. You are inhaling that atmosphere, and the effect is your body is purified, and you have a new body, pure, healthy, and strong. Think this is a temple of God. 5. Blessings. Feel the blessing of all saints and seers, and know they're helping me. 6. Prayer to Guru. Pray to my spiritual Guru, Swami Ramananda. Obedience to the Guru. Repeat the mantra 10 times as I meditate on him. 7. Repeating main mantra. Repeat the main mantra to Sri Ramakrishna on my fingers. 8. Meditation and japa. 9. Meditate only. And 10. The fruits of japa and prayer for devotion. Same prayer for devotion, freedom from bondage, and also offer the fruits of japa and meditation by saying this prayer. I offer the results of my japa and meditation to thy blessed feet, O Lord. The soul of my soul may attain success through thy grace alone. I was Swami Saprakasananda's first Ramakrishna disciple. I received 2 other prayers. One, Swami Brahmananda, my spiritual guide. This prayer I received when initiated along with my mantra. I bow to thee, O sad Guru, thou who destroys the bonds which hold me to this world, thou who bestoweth the visions of truth, together with worldly success and final liberation. Dispeller of ignorance, revealer of true religion, image in the human form of the Supreme Brahman. And the other prayer is a prayer to Sri Ramakrishna. Om Ring, truth eternal thou art, unmoving, transcending the gunas, yet adorable by the gunas. As I have not worshipped day and night with yearning, thy blessed lotus feet, destructive of ignorance, therefore, friend of the lowly, thou art my sole refuge. Devotion, virtue, and worship, which put an end to the cycle of birth and rebirth, prove adequate for the attainment of the supreme truth. Though uttered by mouth, this does not shine in my heart. Therefore, O friend of the lowly, thou art my sole refuge. Instantly they cross the rajas, whose desires attain fulfillment in thee, their devotion being turned to thee, O Ramakrishna. the way of eternal truth. Thy lotus feet, the life of the mortal, quell the waves of death. There, O filler, O friend of the lowly, thou art my sole refuge. Thy holy and auspicious name, O Lord, ending in Shina, destructive of delusion, converts sin into virtue. O soul, goal of the world, helpless am I. Therefore, O friend of the lowly, thou art my sole refuge. When Swami Saprakasananda came to America, he was promised financial assistance. When he arrived, he found there would be no financing. When Swami came to St. Louis, the other Swamis in America helped him financially. Later, he paid them back all that they had given him. Swami started to give lectures in the hotel, but collections weren't enough to pay for the rent of the hall. He moved to a smaller hall, but still the money wasn't sufficient to pay the rent. Since he had already started Tuesday and Thursday classes at his apartment, he added Sunday evening lectures also. In the summer, he would give up the apartment and go on vacation to save money. He did this for 2 years. During this time, I took the altar pictures home with me. He told me very strongly that the pictures were not to be covered while transporting. Mr. Oldendorf insisted in taking me home with the pictures. It was very hard in this time to watch Swami struggle against so many obstacles. No matter which way he tried to establish the center, there were barriers. And he also had health problems. His faith in Ramakrishna and Kali was so strong. He told me, the soil in St. Louis is not fertile. It had to be spiritualized. It will take longer here, but there will be a Ramakrishna temple in St. Louis. There were also people in Kansas City who wanted a Vedanta center. They came to ask Swami Saprakasananda for support or to be part of the St. Louis Center. He gladly accepted them and guided them as if they were his own. That was 40 years ago. All of those in Kansas City have worked very hard to stay together. The Vedanta societies in the United States are very proud of them. Their faith has laid down the spiritual roots for the future. I would like to mention Carol and Eugene Condon. I know we all give our thanks to them. Carol did not live to see her dream come true, but Eugene did live to see their dream realized. In conclusion, I understand I was only to write about Swami Saprakasananda's first years. I know the workers that will follow us will come and take our place. It will be the younger generations in the future who will keep the spiritual truth alive. Thank you. From a disciple of the Vedanta Society of St. Louis, Mae Kunz.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Mae, for those very fine words. I'd like to tell you a little story about Swami's teaching methods that happened to me many years ago. I call it the big bookcase caper. Taught me a very important lesson. It's a simple story, but it taught me probably the most important lesson I could have learned in Vedanta. Swami called me into the library one day and started to outline to me the idea he had of some bookcases for the library. The bookcases we had were overrun with books, and our library was growing. So he was describing a bookcase that was about 5 feet wide, 7 feet tall, and had sliding glass doors. And I was wondering all this time where we were going to find a bookcase like that. So after he described it, he turned to me and he said, "Can you do this?" Well, before I go on, I'd like to tell you what "can you do this" meant with Swami. With the ordinary person, "can you do this" means, I don't think you can do it, but maybe you can, and let's see if you want to try. With Swami, it meant, I know you can do it. Are you willing? So I hadn't done much building up to this time, but I said, "Yes, Swami, I can try." So he said, "Very good." So I went home and I made a drawing of the bookcase, and I brought it back and showed it to him. And he said, that bottom shelf is going to take the weight of all those books. It'll have to be made very strong. And I explained to him, I said, "No, Swami, it has to hold the books that are on the shelf itself. The shelves above, the load is transmitted to the sides of the bookcase and down to the floor. no, the bottom shelf has to hold all the books, the weight of all the books, so it'll have to be very strong. You'll have to put extra bracing in it. Well, I argued a little while, got nowhere. So I said, all right, and I went home, and over a period of time I built the bookcase. And I considered not putting the brace in there, and then I thought, no, he wanted that brace, well, I better put the brace in there. So I put an extra brace in. I brought the bookcase over and set it up. He came downstairs to look at it. The only thing he asked was, did you put that brace on that bottom shelf? And I breathed a sigh of relief that I could say, yes, Swami, I did. So what did I learn from this? I learned that you have to surrender your own will to His will. And if I couldn't surrender my will in a simple thing such as building a bookcase, how could I surrender it to Him in important matters that I might not understand in the spiritual life that He asked me to do? So this is the way that Swami taught in everyday matters around him. He constantly picked up ideas that he could use to teach the devotees what they needed to be taught. Our next speaker is Irene Bergman, our present secretary, and I'm sure she'll have some words of interest for us. Thank you.
The first time that we ever saw Swami Saprakashananda was when he spoke in a hall on Grand. I don't remember the name of the hall. I don't remember what he lectured about, but there were two things that he said that stuck in my mind. First, he prayed a prayer. God is my mother. God is my father. You've all heard the prayer. I had never heard, coming from a Christian background, my father was a Methodist minister. I'd never heard God called mother. And I thought that was very strange. The other thing that he said, he told a story from the Upanishads, I believe it is, of the two birds sitting in the tree. The one at the top of the tree immersed in bliss, and the other one at the bottom of the tree, eating the sweet and the bitter fruits, and then looking up and seeing this blissful bird and hopping a little higher. And each time he looked up, he hopped a little bit higher. That was the last service of the season. And after that, Swami held his services in the apartment at 5463 Delmar. I'd like to mention some of the early devotees here. Of course, as you've heard before, there were the Oldendorfs. Ruth Peterson, who did so much for Swami. There was Mae Kunz. There was a Dr. Mine. There were two Mrs. Harrisons. One, as I remember, was a musician. The other one was an elderly lady with flaming red hair who loved Vivekananda. And that was the burden of her song always, how she loved Vivekananda. There was a Mrs. Grossman, a tall, imposing lady who carried a big bag. And it seemed that every time Swami would start the lecture, she'd sit in front of him and start rummaging in that bag. And there was a competition between Swami and Mrs. Grossman as to who was going to win out as far as noise was concerned. There were the Sedgefields, Bob and Phyllis, and Norman Schrager, Helen Sunley, Rosalie Moody, whom we all knew here and loved, and Hilmer Harold, one of the very first St. Louisans that Swami saw. I have a couple of stories that I would like to tell that are favorites of mine. I was over here. Swami was going through a period of when he thought omega oil would cure everything. He talked about omega oil so much I began to think it would cure everything from leprosy to an ingrown toenail. And one day, when I was over here, I said to him, "Swami, that's patent medicine." And I said it very disdainfully. A short time later, my mother wrote me and asked me if I would pick up a salve for her because the ends of her fingers were getting split and they bled and she was having problems. Of course, I said I would. And on my way over one afternoon to do some work for Swami, I bought the medicine. Of course, as he always did when you had a package, he always said, "What's in your package? What's in your package? What's in your package?" So I told him. And he grinned. And with a mischievous look in his eye, he said, "Is it patent medicine?" My husband and Swami, though my husband had great regard for Swami, they didn't always agree. And when they did, they'd have an argument. One time, they were arguing. And Swami, in exasperation, said, "Well, if you don't like it, why don't you leave?" And my husband said, "Because you are the most spiritual man I have ever known." I can testify to that fact. For one day, when I was having conflicts between my Christian upbringing and Hinduism, Swami came to me in a high spiritual mood, touched me, and transformed my life. My husband was transferred to Texas for 11 months. And when we returned, Virginia Ward and Vera McCutcheon were working at the Society. Virginia?
Thank you, Irene. I'd like to tell you a little story of Swami as a first-class physician. We were having a board meeting in the library, and I don't remember any of the words that were spoken or what we were talking about. But I do remember Mr. Greenberg was there. Mr. Greenberg, many of you remember, was an elderly member who was chairman of the board for a while. And we were sitting around the table, and Mr. Greenberg said something, and I spoke rather harshly to him. Like I say, I don't remember any of the words. Swami turned on me and rebuked me severely. And an astonishing thing happened. The force of his words drove my mind inward, deep within. And we all sat around the table in silence for perhaps a minute. And then gradually the conversation began to start again, and we carried on our business. But what did I learn from this? Well, first I learned that I shouldn't speak harshly to Mr. Greenberg. But more importantly, I learned that there's a place deep inside each one of us where we can retreat and nothing can touch us. They could hack our bodies to pieces and we would not be touched. We're going to reach that place. Our next speaker is Virginia Ward. We all know Virginia has been here many years, done yeoman service for the Swami, and now she will tell us about her years.
There will be some reading. It is a privilege and a rare moment in my life's journey to speak of a momentous happening which took place in this city simply through hearing and seeing an illumined Hindu teacher who was to become my guru and guide me into the world of spiritual light and bliss. It can be said or described in no other terms because the impossible can be made possible by the magic touch of an impassioned devotee of the Lord, Swami Satprakashananda. This special event took place in 1946. I had returned from India after a tour of duty with the American Red Cross. Looking back upon this episode in my life, there were some curious incidences which I should have noted while there, such as the Durga festival in Calcutta, masses of people dancing in the street, Durga images in the small villages near the air base where I was stationed, and seeing at a distance 12 Shiva temples, which I now feel were the Shiva temples at Dakshinaswar. So close, but as far away from my consciousness as the moonlight falling on the darkness of night. Yet there was a grand viewing of the Himalayan range at Darjeeling. It was though I was suspended at a great height over the vast continent of India, moving, observing, but untouched as yet by its hidden currents and depths. And if I may express it this way, I crash-landed at the feet of Swami Satprakashananda in the heartland of America. It all began one Tuesday evening in the spring of 1946. A childhood friend whom I knew intimately, who was a skilled musician and an intellectual, and who apparently had met Swami Satprakashananda and visited him in his apartment, suggested I meet him, and also suggested reading about a certain Swami Vivekananda. My curiosity was aroused, and I agreed to meet her on a Tuesday evening, a class night, I believe. My mother accompanied me, and we waited outside an apartment building on Delmar Avenue. It began getting later and later, and we finally realized she was not going to keep the appointment. At this point, I was determined to go ahead and find this person on my own. I had an address, and so we entered the apartment building, but it was the wrong street entrance, which forced us to walk down a long, long corridor, not knowing exactly where we were. But at the very end of the corridor was the number we were given. I pushed open the apartment door and said, "Swami," and entered as though it was the most natural thing in the world to do. We were invited to sit down. There was an awkward moment or two, and so I said, could we buy a book on Swami Vivekananda? And the Swami immediately put in my hands all 4 volumes of Vivekananda's writings: Jnana Yoga, Karma, Bhakti Yoga, Raja Yoga, and Inspired Talks. Since we arrived late, we left shortly after receiving the books. I'm sorry about my voice. To continue, I waited 1 month, and then my friend formally introduced me to the Swami. After the first lecture, it was, quote, all over for me, end of quote. And I knew I had, incredibly enough as it seems, I knew I had heard these Vedic truths before. The words were familiar, and so my metaphysical journey was ended. Then began the task of absorbing the cultural background of India. In the apartment living room was a table shrine with pictures of Sri Ramakrishna and his disciples. I hardly noticed the shrine, much less acknowledging the pictures and their significance. But it was the living words of the teacher who sat in a handsome carved chair and delivered the meditations and lectures that filled me with joy. At one point, later in the year, I became so enthusiastic one Tuesday evening that I stamped my feet on the floor and cried, "Bravo, bravo." Impossible. The Swami would leave St. Louis during the summer months. This signaled cleanup time in the apartment. Paint was procured from the manager, and my mother, Ruth Peterson, and myself stood on ladders and painted walls, ceilings, and so forth. This was our sanctuary, 3 tiny rooms, but peace and joy still vibrated in these rooms. The devotees who came to the apartment were old hands, knowing the Swami's daily schedule and going about the business of helping Swami with flowers, food, and so forth. Many Sunday noon dinners were enjoyed at the apartment. There were unscheduled visits also, when there was no automobile available, so Swami and I cheerfully took a bus or streetcar. It so happened that Mr. Oldendorf gave up his secretaryship, and suddenly I found myself with the title secretary. At this point, a title meant nothing to me. All I wanted was to hear the magic words, quote, "the effulgent being that pervades the whole universe," unquote. Then, believe it or not, the walls of the apartment expanded and disappeared, and a divine being was there in those blessed words. Quite often the living room would be crowded with young university students sent by Houston Smith, who would accompany them. Houston was an ardent devotee of the Swami's and played an important role in supporting the center at that time. Then suddenly, a terrible event threatened. The Swami received a telegram asking him to accept and conduct the center in Philadelphia, as the Swami there was returning to India, adding financial support of $10,000. That was included in the offer. My world fell to pieces. I went home and cried for 3 days. There was nothing but emptiness ahead for me if the Swami left. It was not a personal feeling, but a vision of loss so grave that nothing in this world could compensate for it. It was nothing less than the loss of a radiant field of spiritual light. There was a happy ending, of course. Everyone knows who sits in this chapel that a crisis was averted. This event spurred the need to have a permanent building for the society, and funds were gradually accumulated. My mother and Mrs. Vera McCutcheon were contributors in the beginning. Then gradually devotees in St. Louis and Kansas City gave generously. And so the impossible became the possible, a permanent home for the Vedanta Center in St. Louis. Yet, still another grave crisis arose. The Swami's health deteriorated, and a spinal operation was performed. The operation was not a complete success, and to see the fragile body of the Swami bravely struggle to regain the power to move his limbs as before was a heartbreaking experience. An interval of several years intervened in which the secretaryship passed to Mrs. McCutcheon. My attention was focused on my mother and father, who gradually became ill, and their passing occurred in 1950 and 1953. Again, the center had staunch devotees who performed in many wonderful ways. There was really no true break in the worship of Ramakrishna. Special worship honoring the birthdays of Sri Ramakrishna, Brahmananda, Premananda, Shivananda, Swami Vivekananda, the Holy Mother, Sri Krishna, the goddesses Durga and Kali, began in the years of Swami Satprakashananda's stay in the apartment. There was an incident involving my participation in preparing rice pudding, which is considered a sacred offering. It began in the apartment, where I watched carefully how this extraordinary concoction was put together. Then gradually, I gained the courage to prepare this simple offering of milk, rice, and ground condiment seeds, and still have the privilege of I still have the privilege of preparing this offering. Nearly every important function continued in the new center. Lectures, visits of different swamis of the Ramakrishna order, out-of-town devotees from California, Texas, New York, Chicago. Gradually, the swami began work on different manuscripts, such as The Method of Knowledge, The Goal and the Way, The Universe, God and God Realization, his reminiscences of his early days of the Ramakrishna order, his meeting with Swami Brahmananda, his guru. The Sunday lectures continued. His moods deepened, and the lectures, to my mind, seemed charged with divine inspiration, so much so that a tape recorder was made available and his lectures were recorded on tape. These were especially helpful for the Kansas City devotees. My initiation took place rather abruptly. All the Swami said was, "It is time." And so the precious event took place in the new center, in the private shrine upstairs. 4 hours of absolute silence, with the Swami sitting in front of the altar. The silence was broken by Sanskrit chanting. Then the devotee receives the mantra, sacred word, sitting close to the teacher. It is a momentous few minutes in an aspirant's life and promises realization of God in this very life. Still, there are mundane tasks in this life, and those who came to this center played different roles, such as cook, housemaid, and social glad-hander, and so forth. Then there was personal attendance on the Swami, and in this task, Robert Berninger played a major role. Such sensitive attention to the Swami's wants, his gentleness, his compassion for the Swami, was a miracle in its own way. Many times I saw this scene. Bob kneeling at the foot of Swami's bed, massaging the Swami's feet, and the Swami lying in complete relaxation on the bed. The Swami was usually available to visitors. He dressed in a rather formal way, American style. Once he asked me whether my father always wore shoes. I said, yes, always. Shoes were a problem, and for him, because he regularly walked in Forest Park nearly every day. His shoes had to fit perfectly. Several times I had the privilege of touching Swami's feet after he returned from his walk in the park. I removed his shoes and massaged his feet. So many scenes of the early days of the society are still in my mind. Unfortunately, my time for this talk is limited. But I would like to read some quotations which were favorites of the Swamis. I'm sorry about my voice. Smaller than the smallest, greater than the greatest, is the real self of man, dwelling in the depths of his heart. Rare is the wise person who, desirous of immortality, turns his thoughts inward and realizes the self through the purification of the body and the mind and becomes free forever. Peace, peace, peace unto all. May that Supreme Lord grant us our heart's desire for the attainment of freedom from all bondages and sufferings. May he lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to eternal existence. May his benign face ever shine before us. May his compassionate eyes ever protect us. May his loving arms ever guide us along the right way of living. Peace, peace, peace.
Thank you, Virginia. That was a very well done piece and very interesting picture of earlier days. I'd like to tell you a little story about that taught me a lesson that has stayed with me ever since and undoubtedly will stay with me the rest of my life. Some years ago, Swami decided to build a vestibule out on the front porch. It was aluminum and glass. Many of you remember the vestibule. The idea of having the vestibule was so when we had large gatherings, people coming in the front door wouldn't bother the people that are already here. They could come through the vestibule and into the bookstore and around that way. So we had the plans drawn up, and then we found out that we had to have a drawing in color of the front of the house, showing how it would look before we could get a building permit. So Swami turned to me and said, "Can you do it?" So there was that "can you do it" again. Not much of an artist, but I said, "I'll give it a try, Swami." So I made the drawing, colored it, and I was quite proud of it. And I brought it over here to a board meeting and spread it out on the table in front of him, and thinking, boy, everybody's going to think this is a real great drawing. First thing Swami said when he looked at it was, "This drawing won't do." And I, of course, said, "But Swami, this is what they asked for. This is what they want." "No, this drawing won't do." I argued some more, and then all of a sudden the light struck. It was like the sun coming out of the clouds. And I saw my attachment to that silly drawing and how it was bringing all this quarreling, unhappiness. And I felt all my tension draining away. And I said, "All right, Swami, I'll do it over." He said, "This drawing will do very well." So, of course, I learned from this that attachment brings in its wake all kinds of misery, anger, misunderstanding. I won't say I haven't been attached since then, but I can say that it's been somewhat lessened by that lesson. Our next speaker was to be Marie Oetting. She had to go out of town, but she did send us, or give us, a tape-recorded talk, which we will now play.
31 years ago was my first visit to the Vedanta Society in St. Louis. My husband and I had been directed here through an interesting experience. We had attended a parent-teachers meeting where Houston Smith was the main speaker. Following his talk, everyone was invited to have refreshments in the cafeteria. During coffee and cookies, my husband asked Dr. Smith, "If you had a wife who wanted to know God, where would you take her?" Dr. Smith was then professor of religion and philosophy at Washington University, as well as an ordained Methodist minister. Also, he had just produced the Religions of Man series on Channel 9, so he seemed an appropriate person to whom to pose that question, although the personalness of my husband's question startled me. Dr. Smith looked at my husband quietly, and then very gently he said, "Mr. Oetting, I would not answer most people this way, but you seem so sincere and earnest. I will tell you the person who has helped me the most since I came to St. Louis." My husband and I both expected one of the outstanding Christian ministers' names to come forth, but instead he said, "It is a Hindu teacher by the name of Swami Satprakashananda." My husband replied, "Is he at the Vedanta Society?" While Dr. Smith nodded yes, I astonishingly asked my husband how he knew about that. Until 3 days before, he had never heard of it, but a client had come in his office to have an estate plan rewritten, designating the Vedanta Society in that instrument. A remarkable coincidence, it seemed to both of us. Then Dr. Smith said, "The meetings are held on Tuesday night and Sunday. If you go, you must go at least 12 times, or you should not go at all. That was 31 years ago, and I remember it like it was yesterday. Swami's accent was very difficult for me to understand, but after a dozen services, gradually, it became clearer. There are many, many stories of how Swami taught us, but I shall choose just 3 from my personal experience to share with you. One Friday morning, as was my custom, I was preparing the vases in the shrine for the flower offering. My mind was on the various activities I had scheduled for the rest of the day. Inadvertently, I knocked over a vase and damaged one of the flowers, as well as spilling the water. At that very moment, Swami came from his room to the table where I was working. Very flustered, I made some kind of an excuse and apology. With great affection, but very sternly, he said, "It's not the damage to the flower and vase that matters, but your inattention to your work." That lesson has served me well in my life as a householder as well as in my spiritual disciplines. Once a year, Swami supervised the food preparation by the devotees in the kitchen here. The occasion was always the celebration of Ramakrishna's birth anniversary, and food was prepared for about 100 people. Early on Saturday morning and well into mid-afternoon, 10 or 12 women worked together in the kitchen and breakfast room area. During the repetitious vegetable preparation, conversation frequently drifted on toward worldly subjects or family matters. Whenever that occurred, Swami seemed to magically appear, telling us to cease our idle chatter and repeat our mantra silently. Sometimes he asked one of us to read aloud from the scriptures or reminiscences of the disciples, while the others continued their kitchen chores. This was indeed an unexpected discipline for Western women from the Midwest part of this country, but the lessons he taught us were always crystal clear for each one of us. The last story I want to share is very personal, and I considered a long time whether or not to tell it. But because it's been so important to me, I have decided that I want to tell it to you. After reading and attending services for several years, I went to Swami as I had seen others do, seeking initiation. During my lifetime, I had not asked my parents for anything, and when they thought it proper for me, they let me know when I should have something. Consequently, one of the ways of learning humility and rejection had not been part of my experience. Therefore, I went to Swami with great sincerity, asking that when he thought I was ready for initiation, to please let me know. I had been serving regularly and attending classes and reading besides my family responsibilities. So I was very surprised when he said, "You will never be fit to be given initiation. You must ask." This answer so astonished me, I left to think about the meaning for me. After several weeks, the confirmation verse I had received from my childhood Christian church came clearly back to me. Ask, and you shall receive. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. It was a clear directive to me again. Immediately, I made an appointment to see Swami and begged him for initiation. Swami's ability to teach me important lessons through small experiences has continued to bless my life. I want to just say a word about the wonderful opportunity it has been for me once I was asked to make this talk this morning. I regret very much that our plans have taken us out of town, but the preparation time, the intense recalling, thinking, meditating about the experiences Swami gave me during all these years at the Vedanta Society has been one of the greatest joys I have experienced. I want to thank Swami for asking me to take part in this, and I thank you very much for allowing me to share it with you.
That was from Marie Oetting. Our next speaker is Bob Berninger.
Well, when I came to the Swami, I was thoroughly convinced that there had to be more to life than what I had experienced in this world. But I also came with the typical Western outlook on life, which is the scientific approach, and that reason can solve all problems, and that anyone who believed that there was some, I'll have to use the word, psychic powers or ability of a person to affect another person without touching them or doing anything, I thought anyone who believes this has something wrong with their mind. They're mentally defective. So when I came to the Swami, I give you this background because he apparently realized, well, here's someone that will need drastic methods. I hesitated like Marie Oetting to tell my personal experiences, but I feel that it's necessary, so I will tell you. I had been coming about 6 months, and by that time, Swami, before that, Mrs. McCutcheon, who was the secretary, as it was mentioned earlier, if there was something to be done, she would tell me, Swami, no, he wouldn't tell me. He was very strict. You'd have to come a long time before he'd ask you to do something. So I'd been coming about 6 months, and he was finally asking me to do something. Now, my brother and I came together. So this was a Sunday after a Sunday service, and he asked us to do some minor job. I don't recall what it was. We did the job, and when I went to tell him we had finished and goodbye, he was eating in the dinette. And here again he asked me to do something, apparently with the windows. So I walked behind the table and did whatever it was, but as I looked back, I happened to notice that he was looking at me quite intensely. And it didn't bother me, but I was aware of it. So I told him goodbye, got in the car, and I used to drive down Lindell Boulevard. Now, I hadn't gotten more than about 3 blocks down the street when all of a sudden I was overcome with this, I guess euphoria would be the word, very intense. So much so that I pulled the car over to the curb and asked my brother to drive because I thought I just can't drive under these conditions. And it stayed with me almost all the way back home. And I was asking myself questions. I said, what is causing this? The Swami? No, can't be the Swami. I guess there's some, I maybe ate something. Well, I don't know, it might have been a year later, and I was working now in the evenings. I would come from work and work here. The same thing happened. One night I went to tell him goodbye, and again he was looking at me very intensely. I'm going down Lindell Boulevard and about the same distance away, but this time a feeling of extreme sadness So much so that I couldn't control myself. I began to cry. In fact, I was sobbing. This lasted a few minutes, then it passed. And like a pendulum, instead of coming back to normal, it went to the other extreme. And I felt such a wonderful feeling, such a joyful feeling. Again, I couldn't control myself, and I began to laugh. All the time this was happening, I was thinking, I hope there's no one driving alongside of me. I'll think, my gosh, this guy is completely gone. So again, the question, why did this happen? It can't be the Swami. Now, the third thing that happened, this was on a Saturday morning. When I used to come and work, I'd come about 9 o'clock or 9:30. And in those years, Swami was always lived by himself. He would go into the shrine about 4:30 or 5 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes maybe wouldn't come out until 10 o'clock. So that quite often when he would come to let me in, he would be coming directly from the shrine. And I know the difference between walking as a cripple and staggering. And he would be staggering. And of course, I hadn't read much of the Vedanta writings. And I would notice this, and I'd think, well, I don't smell any alcohol. He's not drunk. Maybe he's taking something, but never mind, I'll go ahead. This morning, as usual, he took me into the kitchen. He says, oh, we must see if there's something for you to eat. So I'm leaning against the kitchen sink, and the refrigerator's to my left. And Swami opens the refrigerator and looks down to see what's in there. And for some unknown reason, I thought I'll look too. So I leaned forward to look. And all at once, like an electric current went through my head. Not pain, but this vibration. And it was pulling me forward. I straightened up and leaned back against the sink. And in a few seconds it left. Now, I never said anything to the Swami about it. I never had anything like that happen to me before. It hasn't happened since. And I've been in that position that I was in looking in the refrigerator many times. So, as I say, now that I look back, there's no doubt in my mind that he was doing this. How he did it, I don't know. But he did. Then there was one other incident that my brother and I were involved in. My brother used to like to go, he liked fast cars. In Alton, Illinois, they had a drag strip. And he went there, and he got really excited about it and asked me to go. And I went, and I got a little excited too. So we had gone maybe 3 or 4 times. And one Sunday after the lecture, the Swami asked us to wait. He wanted to mail a letter. Mrs. McCutcheon was writing it. And while we were waiting, he began to ask us questions. He said, you live in Illinois? And I said, yes. And I was thinking, well, he knows that. Why is he asking? He says, and you live with one aunt and your brother lives with the other? And yes. Why is he asking these questions? He asked a few more questions. Then he said, how far is it to Alton? Now, Alton had never been mentioned to the Swami. He knew we lived in East St. Louis. Nothing about Alton had ever came up. So I was thinking to myself, Alton, why did he ask Alton? I told him how far it was. Well, that was the last question he asked. He says, I shall go now. And he left. I get out in the car, and Bill looks at me, and he says, he said Alton, didn't he? I said, yes. Now, it's very interesting that we both came to the same conclusion. The Swami was telling us, don't go to Alton to see the drag races. So we stopped. We didn't go back after that. So I thought I would tell you this so that you'll get a little different view of the Swami, what he could really do when he wanted to. But he was a teacher, a spiritual teacher. And I used to go with him sometimes when he would be invited to give a lecture or to attend a symphony, whatever. And quite often I would sit next to him. And one time I noticed, happened to glance down and see that all his hands were down here trying to hide it, I noticed that he was counting, repeating his mantra. He told you what to do, then he set the example. And he would repeat the mantra going, he would repeat it coming back. And one time in a symphony program, I happened to look over and he was repeating it during the symphony also. He was showing you what you do if you want to live a spiritual life. So, and I will have to show you another side of the Swami. He had quite a sense of humor. He had a way of not hearing what you told him if he didn't want to hear it. He would ask you to repeat it, and in such a way that you would become so frustrated that you'd quit. You wouldn't ask him. You'd just give up. This had to do with Mrs. McCutcheon, and it was, I think, they were preparing for one of the Ramakrishna functions, and Mrs. McCutcheon wanted to do something which wasn't the usual procedure. She was standing at the bottom of the back stairway, and Swami was at the top. And she was telling him what she wanted, and he was saying, and she'd say something, and he'd repeat a word which was similar to what she was saying, but had nothing to do with the situation. So she was talking about the Ramakrishna dinner, and finally, becoming very irritated, she shouted about 3 times, "Ramakrishna, Ramakrishna, Ramakrishna." He looks down, he says, "In the kitchen?" Then an incident with Mrs. Moody. We were eating, and there was quite a bit of food, and leftovers was a problem, and Rosalie was sitting right next to me, and Swami was at the far end of the table. And he was talking to someone, so Rosalie was wondering about the vegetables and the leftovers. And I said, very softly, I said, "Rosalie, take them. You take them." "Oh," she says, "Can I?" I says, "Yes, you take them." Swami gets through talking to whoever it was he was talking to, then he turns to Rosalie and he says, "Do not take the vegetables, Mrs. Moody, do not take them." She looks at me, her eyes real big, she says, "I thought he was hard of hearing." Well, I want to tell you something about his last years, the last part of his life, because I think it's important. Telling you something about how he suffered. And it was during this period, this was something else, that even during this time, he could still have his sense of humor and he could still live his life. How he could do it, I don't know. But anyway, he would eat off of a bed table, sitting in a chair. He would get out of his bed into a little wheelchair, not a regular wheelchair, but a little wheelchair with small wheels. And I would pull him over to the chair that he would sit in. He would get in that chair, and we would put this table in front of him, and he would eat. And he had a habit of pulling a plate close to the edge, sometimes letting it hang over a little. And Cecile, who is now a nun in Hollywood, she used to also give service. And she would notice this and tell him, "Swami, you're going to spill the food. Push the plate back onto the table." Well, one evening, the plate was close to the edge, and before he'd even had one bite of the food, it did. It fell off into his lap. And Cecile saw it, and I could see that she was ready to scold him. Now, I can't imitate the Swami, but his voice changes, and he says, "Oh," he says, "Cecile, you take such wonderful motherly care of me. You're such a wonderful mother. Oh," he says, "you treat me so kindly." So what could Cecile do? Nothing. She had to laugh and couldn't scold him. But during this time, I sometimes, like on a Saturday night, he would call me. He had a cowbell that he would ring. Mrs. McCutcheon got it for him. So when he wanted me, he would ring this cowbell. Anyway, throughout the night he would call me. And many Saturday nights, I would be with him almost all night long, and he would be scratching so much that the skin would tear. He would bleed. One time he even went so far as to say, "Death is better than this." And yet, Sunday morning, he would get dressed, and I would take him into the audience room, and people would come in to visit him. And I don't know how many times, and people will remember this, they would come out after the meeting and say to me, "How well he looks, how wonderful he looks. He must not be as sick as we think." Now, how he could do that, I don't know. But anyway, this happened many times. And I mentioned his staggering. And at that time I didn't know read. I hadn't done much reading, and I didn't know that there was a state referred to as God intoxication. And I think Swami himself admitted this, not saying, "Oh yes, I've had samadhi," or this and that. The way he did it is that every day, quite often, he would sing 2 lines of a song which he remembered. He couldn't remember the whole song. The song was something to the effect, "I have made thee the pole, or thee I have made the pole star of my life." He would sing these 2 songs, and then he would recite in Sanskrit 3 verses from the Crest Jewel of Discrimination. And I'm going to read these verses. "The wise one realizes in his heart through samadhi the infinite Brahman, which is something of the nature of eternal knowledge and absolute bliss, which has no exemplar, which transcends all limitations, is ever free and without activity, which is like the limitless sky, invisible and absolute. The wise one realizes in his heart through samadhi the infinite Brahman, which is devoid of the ideas of cause and effect, which is the reality beyond all imaginations, homogeneous, matchless, beyond the range of proofs, established by the pronouncements of the Vedas, and ever familiar to us as the sense of ego. The wise one realizes in his heart through samadhi the infinite Brahman, which is undecaying and immortal, the positive entity, which precludes all negations, which resembles the placid ocean, and is without a name, where there are neither merits nor demerits, which is eternal, pacified, and one." Now, he used to recite those verses in Sanskrit, chant them. And one morning he was chanting these verses, and Swami Chaitanananda came into the room. And when he had finished chanting, he turned to the Swami, and he said, "Chaitanananda, it is true. It is true." So, from his own words, he's telling you, this is admitting it. So now I'd like to finish by reading what he said on one of the meetings that we had upstairs around the last. After it was over with, he sat quietly for a while, and then he said, "The Swamis you see belong to God. When they become a Swami, they dedicate themselves to one, to God. They belong to God. They cannot claim themselves to belong to India or America or this or that. They know they belong to Him and Him alone. So we do not think too much of a place, that I have come from India and I am here with no family. They dedicate themselves to only one, the Supreme Master of all, God. So we do not think of anything else. Swamis always think that way, think of themselves to be of God. Apparently there is a relation to others and to surroundings, but within himself he knows he belongs to Him and Him alone, to whom everything belongs."
Thank you. Thank you, Bob, for a wonderful memoir. I have one other little story I'd like to tell you. It happened just a couple of weeks before Swami passed away. My voice is going, it seems like. Bob has told you that Swami used to go into the audience room, and after the lectures, the people would come up and greet him. Sometimes he would speak, sometimes he was silent. But this day, I went upstairs to greet him, and I went to the shrine room first. And then I went across the hall and walked into the audience room. I was repeating my mantra as I went across the room, and I bowed down and took the dust of his feet. And as I got up to take a chair nearby, Swami said, "When you repeat the mantra in your heart, a golden thread is created between the heart of the disciple and the heart of the Guru." At that instant, I felt the presence of that golden thread. It has not left me since, and I don't think it'll ever leave me. It is said that the Swami, or the Guru, forgoes his own final liberation until every one of his disciples is liberated. I believe that. And I believe that that golden thread will be there until I reach that goal. We'll close the service with a prayer.
Shastastu vishishya khala prasidatam dhayantu bhutani shivang mito diya manasya bhadram bhajata dadhukshaja adeshvatang no mutirapurituki. May there be peace in the world. May all men and women be gentle and honest. May all think of mutual welfare. May the hearts of all be turned to the highest good. May there be devotion in the hearts of all to the Supreme Lord. Peace, peace, peace unto all. Hari Om Tat Sat.